Well, as an executive coach and having spent time in human resources, I never thought I would be having a conference like this one where we'd be talking about everything from artificial intelligence and machine learning to putting our systems and structures on autopilot. But one of the people who has been a revolutionary at this, really thinking about holistically how it is that we can really drive the organization to unlock its human potential and also be able to drive a structure so that you can have continuous change. The person who coined the term neuroleadership is David Rock. Please welcome David to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. How you all doing? Okay, I see I'm competing with some phones here. All right, gonna have to work hard. One of my favorite quotes, be meaningful, be funny, or be quiet. I'm gonna go for 2 out of 3, I think, to get your attention away from the phone. There's a lot there. Hopefully in this 30 minutes, I'm gonna actually give you some useful insight, not just some funny things, but some useful insight into some challenges that have probably keeping you awake at night, this group, probably literally. Firstly, if you're hearing me for the first time, the accent's Australian, but I've been here 6 years. I'm over the jet lag, okay. I live full-time in New York, where we head up our organization. And I head up an organization that's really unusual. Actually, it couldn't have existed 20 years ago. We synthesize and organize research that's coming out of thousands of labs to develop a more accurate understanding of how people actually work, so that people in charge of, humans make better decisions. Because it turns out the people in charge of humans in big companies are actually using some inaccurate science. Quite a lot of it, scary thought. And that's probably what's keeping you awake at night. We have a bunch of theories in practice that are sort of unquestioned just because they feel right, like, calling people a number, what could possibly go wrong? There's a lot of theories in practice out there that we're sort of never challenging, and I want to challenge some of those, and I've been challenging those for a while. We write research papers, we write peer-reviewed academic research papers, and sometimes we start movements, and kind of by accident we started the whole movement to do no ratings and to really transform the whole idea of performance management. We started that working originally with Juniper. I know our work influenced Adobe and Cargill and Medtronic and many of the other early adopters. And really started a movement in this space. We're now starting a movement in the whole D&I space with the first approach to actually mitigating bias. We've really just come out with that. And a whole new way of thinking about learning as well. But all of it starts with science. How many of you love science? Can I hear a show of hands? How many of you love science? Okay, good. 2 camps, can be in either. It turns out one of them you tend to get it right more often than the other. One of them might be more fun than the other, okay? But science has surprises in it, and our intuitive hunches are not always right. Anyway, so let's talk about feedback. We're hoping to start a movement. Like performance management with no ratings, we're actually hoping to start a movement around feedback. And we do research every year to see if we can find something everyone's been missing. We look for what's the insight that really could be game-changing in these spaces. And that's what I want to share with you today. So firstly, those of you who are still kind of interested in this question of what does it really look like when companies transform their whole performance management strategy, our institute's been researching this trend. Last year, we produced a study that looked at what actually happens when companies remove ratings. And contrary to what you might see out there, if you actually study companies who've done even a reasonable basic job of change management and making sure that conversations do happen in some way, you'll find the results are positive. So last year we studied 27 companies, year 2 to year 5, of a new PM strategy. And what we found, overwhelmingly positive results. We didn't find a single company who went backwards in the quality or quantity of conversations. Not a single company who went backwards in engagement. Not a single company who went backwards in any metric, it turned out. Every single metric that they looked at, random 27 companies, year 2 to year 5, found positive results. So it is, this whole movement that everyone's now working on does seem to be working. At the same time, there's a lot of contentious debate. There's a lot of stuff still being worked out. But one thing everyone agrees on, one thing everyone agrees with, that they want better conversations. Does that make sense? Like everyone wants managers to have better conversations. So we think about that. We think about this question, what is it to have better conversations? We think about that and we say, well, what kinds of conversations? About what, where, when, how, who? Let's study them. And when we look at it, we see that there are 6 main kind of categories of conversation. And you could come up with your own list of 5, 10, 20, whatever. But we see 6, and if you study these conversations, you see something non-obvious. If you actually study like a time and motion study, you'll see goal setting happens once or twice a year. You'll see, number 3, regular check-ins, 2, 4, maybe 6, 8 times a year. You'll see, the end of cycle once, twice, maybe 4 times a year. Comp once, twice a year. Career conversations once a year if you're lucky. Feedback, how often? Actually should be every week. So one of these is a massive outlier in terms of frequency and also in terms of impact. And if you're actually trying to improve conversations, you really are trying to improve feedback, because that's the one that's really happening every single week constantly. But we don't tend to really treat feedback as its own entity. It tends to be kind of lumped in with these other conversations, but it's actually a much more important one, and it's a much more important one to get right. If you can get the feedback right, the end of quarter is easy, right? The end of year is easy. The comp is easy. Does that make sense? But we tend to give sort of the same amount of attention to fixing feedback as we do to the comp conversation, or often the comp conversation gets even more. But we think actually we've got to solve for feedback. So an organization about 18 months ago contacted us and said, can you help us fix the feedback problem once and for all? Because we've run I don't know how many, 20 different feedback classes over the last 10 years, and we don't seem to be making a difference. How many of you have been in more than 5 different feedback training programs, right? We've all been there, and you're running them all the time. So this company called us and said, can you actually fix the feedback problem? And we said, really? It was like a dream project. And they said, can you go and research this? Bring together the SWAT team of research. Bring together the ultimate team of people to really help you. Take as long as you want, as deep as you want. So we started on this project to say, all right, if feedback's the most important conversation, let's try and fix it. And the first thing we did was we said, well, how broken is it? What's the issue? What does it look like? We looked at it from a number of perspectives and all the different studies that are out there on it. And I'm going to show you some data in a minute, but let's do a little thought experiment. Think of someone on your team. How many times a week do they do something that you wish you could say something about but don't? Right? How many times a week do people around you say something and you don't give feedback? Right? Every week. Is it once a month? No. Is it once a week? No, it's quite often, right? Just about every day with just about every person. There's something you wish you could say, and you don't say it. Now, I'm not recommending you do say it, by the way. Right? That's not where we're going here. Because it turns out the way we give feedback right now, it actually does nothing or makes things worse more often than it makes it better. That's a scary statistic. So, anyone that says, let's give you some technology to give feedback faster and better, I'm going to pause for a moment and say, maybe. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the science. Do we want technology to help us do something faster that does nothing or makes things worse? Not sure. Being very polite, aren't I? So it's an interesting thing. So we looked at this question and we said, all right, if you look at the average employee and all the people around them, how many data points of feedback should that person are being withheld from that person? And it's really interesting. It ends up being that ideally, in a perfect world, an individual should be getting feedback that helps them get better many times a day. So an individual should be getting just little nudges, I'm not talking about big things, many times a day, little bits of feedback. How much feedback do people actually get that helps them be better? It's like once a week at best. So we see a gap between the amount of feedback people should get and the amount they do get of at least 2 orders of magnitude. We see it it's somewhere between 10 and 100 times more. It's at least 10 times more. And so how much improvement have we been getting by kind of the last decade? What have we been doing? How much improvement have we been getting? When we tell managers to give more feedback or we give them a tool to enable it, we're making progress. Give them a tool, make progress, absolutely. Give them a Better Works tool, you're going to get an improvement in feedback. Are you going to get a 10 times improvement in feedback? No. So there's something biological going on here. Why don't we give people this feedback? So the gap we think is enormous. But here's the current hypothesis that everyone's going on, and this whole morning so far has been based on this hypothesis. The current hypothesis is to fix the feedback problem is we need to kind of remind, encourage, cajole, provide technology for giving more feedback, right? That's the current hypothesis. But I want to challenge that hypothesis, and I want to challenge that hypothesis by just a really simple idea. Here it is. What do you feel when someone says, hey, can I give you some feedback? How do you feel when someone says, can I give you some feedback? And they're smiling even. Hey, can I give you some feedback? Right? How do you feel? Your heart rate goes up. Even if the person's a friend, even if you're doing amazingly well, what happens to your biology? What happens is you start producing cortisol, your heart rate rises, your skin conducts. If you've got some new technology they have where you can literally see changes in color tone on people's skin through a camera, you can literally see people experiencing a whole different flush of color. Just the phrase, can I give you some feedback, right? So we have this reaction to feedback that's actually very universal, very, very strong, and very unexpected and non-logical as well. It doesn't make any sense, right? But it's pretty much completely ignored. So we have this reaction, and what happens is organizations kind of ignore the fact that people have an intense reaction to feedback. Now, it's really quirky. It's a really quirky thing because it turns out that humans actually love feedback, right? You're wondering, like, what? What do you mean we love feedback? We love feedback. We love it so much, we get it like literally millions of times every second. It makes us happy. If you don't get what I mean, like imagine not getting feedback from your feet for 10 seconds and see how happy you'd be. If you can't feel your feet on the floor, suddenly you'd get abject panic. That's feedback. If you can't determine if you're upright or not, abject panic. If you can't tell if you're falling over or not, right? There's a disease if you're unbalanced, abject panic. Like the absence of feedback is actually really scary because the brain requires feedback constantly for these little tweaks. So a number of perceptions about feedback are wrong, and this is where our research dug in. We believe a number of things about feedback are actually wrong. We've got a whole bunch of things about feedback wrong in the world as we kind of dig into this research further. One of the things that we have wrong is we think we hate feedback. When someone says, can I give you some feedback, what we hear is, can I criticize your work so I can feel better about myself, right? But it's, or as Winston Churchill said, I'm always ready to learn, but I don't like always being taught, right? So we like to learn, so we want feedback, but we don't want to be taught. So here's the thing. We actually don't hate feedback, we just don't like it when it comes from other people. We actually love feedback. Typing on your computer, if you stop getting feedback from one key, if one key feels slightly different to the others, you hate that. You love the feedback of your keys feeling as you expect, right? So we just don't like feedback from other people. Now, why is that? Really simple story. Until we are literally at the age of reproduction, or very close, we get 100% of our resources for survival from other humans, right? How other people feel about us massively matters to us. If other people think we're important, we get more food, we survive better. If other people treat us fairly, we get more resources, we survive better. We get all of our resources for everyday survival from other humans. And so the brain is massively addicted to how people think about us. The brain's obsessed by it, so much so, in fact, that the network that's on all the time until you switch it off to do something like, make a vendor decision, the network that's always on, that's always there, right, is actually the default network of the brain. Literally, it's like the one that's there all the time. It's actually the social network. It's the network for thinking about you and other people and how you all connect and who's better and who's worse, etc. So we're actually always, judging ourselves, judging others, judging connections, thinking about that. It's not just you. We're all doing it. The brain does it. And it's a survival mechanism. So when someone says, hey, can I give you some feedback? Your heart rate goes up because you're detecting a mortal danger. You're detecting a potential threat to your life, right? And you're not far off. I mean, if your status is attacked, if someone says that you are actually worse than you thought you were, this kind of stuff, you'll probably die younger. I mean, higher status makes you live longer, literally. Controlling for income and education. There's a whole book on that. So, you're protecting your status because it does actually help you stay alive. It's not a bad thing. So feedback's a challenge. Like, how do we get around that biological bottleneck? It's really tough. Fighting biological bottlenecks is not the idea. What we want to do is leverage biological bottlenecks, leverage the strengths and weaknesses of the brain. So mistake number one is we think we hate feedback. Actually, we don't really hate feedback. We just hate it from other people. Second mistake we see across the whole field of feedback is that we think that poor performance comes from not knowing one's errors. And if people were just informed, they would change, right? And one of the reasons for this is the way the brain is built. Again, if I'm walking along, I don't really feel my feet until there's a little crack here, until there's a crack in the floor, and then immediately I feel the gap there, right? And the brain doesn't notice things going well. It notices things going badly. In fact, there's a whole network called the error detection network for noticing things that are unexpected or just novel or an error, something wrong. And that stuff really gets attention. It really gets attention in the brain much more. And so we obsess about what people are doing wrong, and we spend a lot of time on that. And we kind of think, well, that's what people need. But it turns out to not be the whole story. In terms of changing behavior, we actually need to build new wiring, not just kind of be conscious of wiring that doesn't work. We actually need to build new networks. How do we do that if we don't know what to do more of? We have to know what to do more of, right? So a lot of the feedback ends up focusing kind of accidentally on the mistakes people are making, but actually the positive feedback or even the corrective feedback that says, all right, this is what to now do. Like that feedback is so much more important to the brain. Third mistake that we think that is kind of the foundational one. Everyone assumes that feedback has to be driven by someone giving it, right? Maybe you start to see where I'm going here. We think that feedback has to be giver-driven. And that makes sense in the old world where the managers knew more, right? When managers knew more about the work, then feedback should be manager down. It doesn't really make sense now when the work's creative, when peers are often better at giving feedback. It doesn't really make sense for the manager to be the one driving it all the time. But we also think that it must be driven by the giver, not just the manager, but driven by the giver, because it just feels good to give feedback. There was this wonderful scene in Central Park a few years ago where there's beautiful sunny day, and these two guys were sitting there, and they'd put a sign up that said, free advice. Should have brought the picture. Free advice. Like they literally, all they could think of doing, like the most fun thing these two smart young men could think of doing on a bright sunny day in Central Park was to give free advice. And the reason for that is it's intrinsically rewarding to actually give advice. So it just feels right to give advice. It feels right. And then thirdly, it literally activates the reward network in the brain. It literally creates a sense of status and autonomy to the person giving. So every ounce of our being says, we should give feedback more. It feels right, makes us feel good. All of that feels right, okay? I'm here to say that this may be the heart of the problem, and possibly, and I'm going to apologize, a bit of a provocateur, but possibly the way to fix feedback is to stop giving feedback. Possibly what we need to do is not create more of those threat responses by having more statements starting with, can I give you some feedback? And instead, start asking for feedback. Now, you might say, oh yeah, we do that now. We tell people to try to ask. No, what happens now in organizations is the model is give feedback, but maybe try and ask for it as well. We actually think we're going to flip it on its head. And the model should be ask for feedback, and then if you really, now and then give it if you have to. But the first thing is ask for it. Now, why is that? There's an enormous difference. There's an enormous difference, a categorical difference between giving it and asking for it. All right, let's give you a scenario. Let me give you a little story here. Imagine you've got a salesperson, a top salesperson has been working on a pitch with a client with their peers watching. They did okay. They did okay, right? But there's a couple of things that person could have done better. They come out of that meeting, how likely is it that their peers are going to say, accurately, like what the person should have done differently, and that person's going to not react to it and going to process it? How often does that happen? Really rare, right? It's really, really rare. And when the people do speak, they're so anxious about what they're saying that they don't tell the truth, they cover it, they obfuscate, they generalize, or they're too detailed as well. So what happens if that person coming out of the meeting, the sales rep, comes out and says, hey, peers, I'd really like your feedback on how that went. And by the way, I'm interested in what I did well, because I need to know what to keep doing. And I'm also interested in maybe what I'm missing that I should perhaps rethink. And be a little kind, because I'm sensitive, but just do tell me what I did well, what to rethink. And by the way, I'm going to ask all of you, so I'm not going to obsess about any one person's opinion. Now, what happens is after every important event, this person asks that, well, guess what? They start getting feedback. They start getting feedback pretty much every single day. And the difference between waiting for people to give it to you and actually asking for it is a 10 times difference. It's a massive difference, and the reason, very simply, the threat response, right? If I ask you to give me some feedback, right? If I see you in the hallway, and I'm going to do this to at least 20 of you today, by the way, so don't be surprised. If I see you, I'm going to ask you for feedback on my talk. If I ask you for feedback about my talk today, right? Firstly, I'm going to be so much less anxious about that than if you see me in the hall and say, hey, can I give you some feedback on your talk? I'm going to, right? On a scale, if you just see me in the hall and I don't ask, like on a scale of +10 to -10, +10 is feedback's a gift, I'm excited, which doesn't exist, by the way. And -10 is like, totally angry, and -5 is sort of half angry. If you just come up to me in the hallway and say, hey, can I give you some feedback? I'm going to be like -8, even though I know all this research. If you unsolicited come and say, can I give you some feedback? I'm going to freak out. But if I say to you, hey, could you give me some feedback? I'm still going to be negative, but I'm going to be a -1. I'm going to be slightly anxious, but I'm going to be totally open. And the difference is the autonomy. Many of you know my SCARF model, right? Status, certainty, autonomy, related status. If you don't know it, come and see us at the booth. It's been one of the most powerful and sticky frameworks for improving just how people interact, especially managers and teams. But it's raising autonomy. If I choose to ask for your feedback, the act of choosing significantly reduces the threat. It's the choice, right? It's like the difference between choosing to go in the army and being conscripted, right? If you choose to join the army, the same army, but you're so much more engaged than being conscripted. So when I say to you, hey, can you give me some feedback? I'm still anxious because I'm terrified of what you'll say. That's my brain, but I'm a -1. Now the second thing is the odds of 1,100 people, like the odds of 20 of you giving me feedback if I don't ask, 0, right? If I ask you, and I'll hopefully see you later and ask you personally, right? Now, if I ask you, you'll also feel anxious. But boy, instead of like a -9, if I hadn't asked, you'll also be like a -1, right? You'll still be anxious about giving it to me, but you'll do it, right? So both sides are dramatically less threatened. Now, the threat response is driving human functioning. Our brain, like the very basic foundation of the brain, minimize threat. That's the organizing principle of all human behavior. Guess what the second organizing principle of human behavior is? Minimize threat some more. Guess what the third principle of human behavior is? Minimize even more threat. And then you get up to like maximize reward for about principle number 4, all right? The brain is obsessed by minimizing danger. So when feedback is a threat, it's really tough. And so what asking does is it goes right to this issue. Both sides are dramatically less threatened. Here's what else happens. You get feedback all the time. You get to improve constantly. You literally get to improve every day, every week. Now, do you know what one of the most engaging experiences is in all of life? Getting better at stuff, right? Teresa Amabel was right, the progress principle. Getting better at stuff is its own reward. You want to lift engagement? Help people learn faster. Right? You want to be more agile? Help people learn faster. You want to innovate more? Help people learn faster. You want to disrupt innovations? Help people learn faster. Getting people to learn faster is the killer app of all of this stuff. Now, technology is not unessential. The BetterWorks app's fantastic. I love what they're doing with feedback. You can totally use that in this way. The human factor is key. If your strategy is, give feedback. No, I want you to use BetterWorks to ask for feedback, ask for feedback, ask for feedback. Right? It's about what you prioritize. Third point here, anyway, you can ask many people. This is really important. If I just ask you, I'm going to get your bias. If I ask 5 of you, I'm going to get a much more accurate answer. And it's the only way of mitigating bias. And also, I can get the actual feedback I need rather than the feedback you think I need if I ask for it. That's important. Anyway, a huge number of reasons why we need to ask. And we've been modeling the best way to ask. We've done some really fun research on what actually happens when feedback works in the brain. It's research no one had ever done before, which was really surprising. We actually asked the questions like, how do you ask for it well, and how do you give it well when people ask? To say, look, what's the mechanism? And it turns out it's something that's sort of been in the ethers for a while. The essential mechanism is the receiver is able to hold 2 complex ideas in mind at once. Right? They're able to hold a map for how they, let's go back to the salesperson. They're able to hold a map for how they currently sell, excuse me, and then hold a map at the same time, a map like a circuit in the brain, right? Hold a map in the brain as well of how they could sell a different way, right? Where maybe they ask more questions. And they've got to be able to hold both in mind at the same moment, right? And compare and contrast and go, I'm going that way. I'm going to try that way. Right? So they've literally got to do what M. Scott Peck said is really hard, 2 alternative ideas at once, right? And it turns out there's a lot of science of this. It's called mental contrasting. There's all sorts of insights out this. But essentially, this is the required mechanism to create motivation, to create incentive, to create a desire to change, and to create real performance improvement. And it's kind of a drop down on insight. Those of you following my work for a while know that we've been obsessed about, facilitating these moments of insight. Well, the insight is about a new way of doing something compared to a current way. So the way we give feedback as well needs to help people see options and choose them. Here's the central challenge. That's cognitively taxing. It's extremely cognitively taxing to see multiple options in mind. And if people are at all anxious about why you're asking, that's what they'll think about instead. If people are at all anxious about where you're going with this, that's what they'll think about instead. If people are at all anxious about you're attacking them, that's what they'll think about instead, right? Because those things are much easier to think about than holding 2 options in mind, right? People go, we think about what's easy to think about, not what's right to think about. That's what we do. The brain goes down to like water flows downhill. We flow into what's easy to think about, not what's right. So one of the key principles here, it comes back to threat. We've got to, both ask and give feedback in ways that really minimizes that threat response, so people can actually compare options properly. So what do we know about this? So we released this last year. We think there's a movement in this. We've got one pilot going with about 2,000 people right now in a big firm. We've got a bunch of other pilots about to start. We think it's more than just changing the instruction. It's a philosophical change. It's a philosophical change of, to create a feedback culture, everyone's going to ask. Now, who should ask first? It turns out probably the manager should ask first. Who should the managers ask? They should ask their team. If you guys were my team and I say to you, can you give me some feedback? And I listen to it and I ask from all of you, get some feedback. I go through that. The very next week, all of you are going to be asking me for feedback. It's a reciprocity thing. You're straight away going to be asking me, right? So the best way to get feedback flowing is for you to ask for it first, starting from the top. We also need to emphasize that this is what top performers do. We're going to keep coming back to that. People get better because they're getting constant feedback. Don't wait for people to give it to you. You won't get much. If you wait for people to give you good feedback, you're going to get it a few times a week. If you ask for it, you're going to get it a few times a day. How quickly do you want to grow? Right? Do you want to grow every week? Do you want to grow in spits and spurts every few years? So we've also got to show people clearly what this looks like, because it sort of feels scary. It's actually not scary. It's much less scary than giving feedback. But we've got to literally show people what they currently do and a new way and help people compare them to, right? In order for people to have the insight, this is what I need to do. So it's a different way of working. And finally, this is a really key point, build this into your Better Work solutions. Build this into your work streams. This should just be how, part of how work gets done, not just relying on human habit. So I kicked off with, we've been starting movements based on science. I know some of you love science. At least some of you not so much, but some of you really love science. Here's what the science says. You'll probably never get more than 10, 20, 30, 40% improvement in feedback if you focus on encouraging people to give it. The actual gap is 10 times at least. We think you can start to achieve that if you actually focus culturally on getting people to ask for it. It's a kind of twist, it does something, it seems subtle, turns out to be really big. Closing comments, I'm out of time. We have our own summit this year, not as big as this one, much more science. Those of you who said you don't love science, don't come. We have our own summit this year. It's also in San Francisco. It's all about the science, the deeper science of this work. Check out our booth over there if you want to learn about that. If you drop a card at our booth anytime today, we're going to put 20 people in a draw to get a free pass to attend that as well. So drop a card, you can get a free pass to attend that. If you're in the draw of 20. Also, we're going to send out 3 research papers that you wouldn't access otherwise. 3 research papers on this space if you drop a card anywhere down there. We also, in October, we have a big summit. Last year, we had 42,000 sites streaming the event, watching new research coming out. It's 11th and 12th of October, if you can hold that date, over in New York. Closing comment, big thank you to Chris at BetterWorks. Congratulations on a fantastic job pulling a great event together. It really is the biggest goal summit in the world. Some fantastic research here. If I've helped kind of with some provocations to really think about this space and even get even more from technology, then my job here has been done. Thanks very much. Oh, and we're hiring. See us over there.